Welcome to all of you who just joined our Fish for Thought. We are at 15 people strong and it's increasing by the minute. So thank you so much. Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Fish for Thought of 2025. My name is Anis Khalid from the communications team at WorldFish, and I'm your host for today. To those familiar with the setting, thank you again for lending your hour to join us. To those new and wondering what a Fish for Thought is and what you're doing here, well, Fish for Thought, or F4T for short, is a knowledge sharing series established by WorldFish. It is a hybrid platform for sharing, learning, and exchanging implementation knowledge on the breadth of all of our work in food systems research and innovation. So it's not just about highlighting achievements, but delving into the processes, the challenges, and also the lessons learned. And as WorldFish celebrates our 50th anniversary this year, and the event is soon approaching us in June, so make sure you keep your eyes peeled and have that calendar invitation saved. We are happy to welcome you who have played a role in all of our work across research areas and countries. So welcome and thank you again. So do join the conversation happening online, share who you are, where you're from, and how we have collaborated before. To those listening to this audio only, on your drive home or just at work, and you have my voice and our speaker's voice in the background, thanks for joining us podcast style. Happy to innovate with you on all forms of content. All right, so before we begin, a bit of housekeeping rules to all audience members here. Please switch off your cameras and microphones to avoid disrupting the speaker today. However, keep the conversation rolling in the chat, and you'll have a chance to voice your questions or commentaries during the Q&A at the very end after today's presentation. Now, without further ado, I am very excited to introduce today's Fish for Thought topic on aquatic foods and the financing of global nutrition, WorldFish's opportunity Post-N4G 2025. Now, you may be wondering, what is N4G? But I'm not gonna dwell much time on that. I will let our speaker today share more on that. So, I am delighted to introduce Wanjiku Gichohi, Senior Scientist and Impact Area Lead for Nutrition and Public Health here at WorldFish. Wanjiku has been in this field for about 50 years now, so we're really excited to learn from you today. So Wanjiku, over to you.
I think I want to start this presentation with prefacing that we are in uncharted territories, especially when we think about financing, not financing just for global nutrition, just financing for us who are in research and especially who are largely dependent on ODA. And it feels very similar to when COVID hit and we had to think about, how do we move forward and so on. And the conversation I have today, I'd rather call it a conversation, even if you'll be listening. I'll be asking a lot of questions, but also reflecting on, questions and thoughts that arose from attending the Nutrition for Growth Summit. And you'll be able to see, what questions have arisen, what thoughts have arisen in terms of how we move forward for financing as an institution, and my thoughts around that, which I hope you will engage with. But also, to hear your thoughts on what some of these impressions are. And that's why I found Nutrition for Growth Summit important to attend. So to start off, I'll just talk about what the big challenges are we face in our world. And, a lot of these challenges we already know. I'm probably preaching to the choir. And we know that there's an increasing food demand to feed almost 20 billion people by 2050. And you see all the other challenges there that we have. What I'd like to throw in specifically for fisheries, and I had this in my recent LinkedIn post, is that from a recent report specifically for Africa, to maintain the current per capita fish consumption by 2050, aquatic animal food supply or production must increase by 74%. Remember, we just have generally a challenge to feed 2 billion people. But then if we zero down to the fisheries sector, this is our challenge in this one continent. And this likely underestimates the growth that is required to be able to meet the demands once you think about, for example, a lot of the promotion that is being done to increase consumption of aquatic foods. So there's a big questions around that, like how do we feed these people in a sustainable manner, in a way that their nutrient needs are met, but also we take into consideration planetary boundaries and that there are going to be issues around climate change that also need to be thought about. Again, when you think about fisheries and what I have said about consumption, I like showing this slide from work conducted by the Lancet, Lancet Commission that is still ongoing in 2019, because it's largely true. We see that when you look at specific food groups, nutrient-dense food groups, largely fish consumption, in this case, we are using it as a representation of aquatic foods, is largely low across all continents that were considered in this work. When you think about specifically the continents we work, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, you see a particularly low consumption. And the only area region, rather than continent, that seemed to be beyond the recommended 2 to 3 servings per week is East Asia Pacific. So quite a bit of work to do in terms of meeting the recommendations of consumption again. Again, when we look at this recent report from State of Fisheries, we see that the apparent consumption of aquatic animals is still largely highest in Asia and low consumption in Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean. And for me, when I look at this graph, what I see is when we think specifically about consumption, where the opportunity is in terms of ramping up consumption and opportunities around this demonstrating how this can be done within planetary boundaries. We see an opportunity there in Africa, in Asia, still among specific groups that exist. But a lot of work around Asia in terms of consumption would be around how this can be done more sustainably, but also supporting the growth of aquaculture in this section. Again, I said maybe I am preaching to the choir. I think one of the questions that I consistently ask for me in this role is, why is the fisheries sector often overlooked, even when we have information such as this that WorldFish contributed to generating, where you see that the fisheries sector does respond to quite a bit of the sustainable development goals. And often in discussions, even from Nutrition for Growth that I'm going to show later, the fisheries sector wasn't mentioned per se. I mean, and granted, a lot of sectors weren't directly mentioned, but there were, approaches that were mentioned. There was the mention of, for example, biofortified foods and so on. And when you think about this contribution and the nutrient density of aquatic foods, why is this fishery sector often overlooked? And a question for us, even as we think about the changing global financing, is what is our narrative about our offering in terms of nutrition, in terms of multiple benefits and so on, beyond displaying this? Is it the way that we communicate, for example, to policymakers around the importance of the fisheries sector? Is it how we are talking to the donors? What's the black box there around spurring action for growth in the fisheries sector and greater investment in the fisheries sector, not only by donors and philanthropic organizations, but also by states and governments? And of course, I mean, this is just a quote around what I was saying, that aquatic foods have remained hidden as a resource, and us needing to further strengthen our narrative around how we communicate the importance of aquatic foods. And often we say that we should invest in aquatic foods because they offer multidimensional influence. And later I'll show you that one of the questions that we had in our sector, for example, I mean, in our side event is, you can, for example, say $1 invested in nutrition. Right now, this is a data from World Bank, gives back $23 return. Can we communicate the same about the technologies that we promote in fisheries? Can we communicate the same around consumption of aquatic foods in that sense? And the reason I quote that figure is this kind of calculations have been part of the reason there has been a lot of momentum from the 2000s in investing in nutrition. It's just articulating that economic benefit and so on. And maybe that's a discussion we could have as when I finish the presentation. I will not go into what this slide about the value proposition for investing in aquatic foods. I was just emphasizing how do we further contextualize this, especially where we work in our country offices, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific. How do we communicate this to those that need to further invest in the aquatic foods sector? So I would just want to talk about Nutrition for Growth Summit. Yesterday, we had a meeting as the impact leads. Rahma and Michelle were there, and I asked them if someone was giving a presentation about the Nutrition for Growth Summit, what would you want to hear? And I think the first thing they were like, we don't even know what it is, what happens there, why it's important for WorldFish to be present, what kind of thoughts come from then, how does that influence our work? And that's what I'm going to attempt to share with you and hopefully have a discussion with you around that. I'll just start with 2025 is a big year for nutrition. We know, like for us, we're in fisheries, we are looking towards, for example, UNOC and so on, those kind of conferences. But when we think about nutrition specific and food systems transformation discussions, there are various events that are being held here. So the first one that for us in nutrition, working in nutrition, both nutrition specific and sensitive sectors, was the Nutrition for Growth Summit. For us, this was like the curtain raiser for 2025 that was held 27th to 28th April. And this is just the main forum. The other events on that week leading up to the main forum. So that's the Nutrition for Growth Summit. Later in the year in Addis Ababa, it's not 27th to 29th April. I have the wrong date there. That's in July. There'll be the UNFSS +4 stocktake that will happen. And in this UNFSS stocktake, it starts for United Nations Food Systems Summit. And what happens is countries are able to articulate how they've moved forward in terms of their commitments to food systems transformation. Often ministries of agriculture are represented because this is a big sector involved in food systems transformation, but also private sector is involved and so on. Later in the year, this is a nutrition-specific conference that is important for us. Nutrition only happens once every 4 years. This is in the International Union for Nutrition Scientists, ICN, and it will be 24th to 29th August 2025, and interestingly also in Paris, France. This is important because this is where we communicate the latest research that can be advanced for programs and practice in the nutrition sector. And it's probably our biggest gathering. This and another one called the Micronutrient Forum is probably our biggest gathering for those working in global nutrition. Then there's the African Food Systems Forum, that is the AGRF, that will happen in September 2025 in Dakar, Senegal. And this is also around food systems and what is being done around the food systems pathway that will happen specifically for Africa. And finally, there is the SUN Global Gathering that was slated to happen 4 to 6 November in Kigali, Rwanda, but they recently announced that this will not happen. The SUN Global Gathering is the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, and this movement has been particularly important in advocating for the importance of mainstreaming in nutrition across all sectors in government, and just bring various actors together, bringing the private sector, civil society, governments, those involved in research, including academia, to work towards improving nutrition and meeting what we call the World Health Assembly targets. So I just present this to say, of course, we have to, as an institution and with the current funding environment, decide where we are best placed to take part and contribute in advocating for fisheries within the nutrition, addressing nutrition challenges. But I think also it's an opportunity to further work more strongly with our country offices for us to have representation in some of these forums, because in our country offices, that's where we are piloting various approaches to demonstrate what works and for whom and where. And these are areas where we can bring further a spotlight to the work that we're doing. And I hope to see participation for WorldFish, particularly in the AGRF, which previously we have not been strongly participating. And this year it was good that we were part of the Nutrition for Growth Summit. So what is the Nutrition for Growth Summit and why should WorldFish be represented? And I will try to do this in the next maybe 10, 15 slides to just give you an impression of what it was. I hope that I'll paint a mental picture of how it was organized, who was there, what were the kind of discussions going on, and how was the fishery sector represented or not. So the Nutrition for Growth Summit is a global pledging moment to drive greater action toward ending malnutrition. And it's malnutrition in all its forms. So it's micronutrient deficiencies, but also thinking about overweight and obesity and so on. The summit is often held in countries that have either held the Olympics or the Paralympic Games or are going to host the G7. And the idea is that we attract the momentum that was built from the visibility of those events. I mean, obviously in the background is that often then the donors are coming from the global north, and that's who is being targeted to as donors to be there. But the people who attend are not only philanthropic and other donors that give ODA assistance, and I'll explain that a bit. Historically, it started in 2013, and it started in 2013 after what was formed as targets to be met by 2025, which are called the World Health Assembly targets. And this World Health Assembly targets are around addressing stunting and anemia and so on. And unfortunately, none of the countries are fully on course to address all 5 targets. I mean, and this is how Nutrition for Growth happened. This is how the Scaling Up Nutrition movement was formed and so on. In 2013, the summit was held in the UK. In 2017, it was held in Italy, even if we know at that time the games were held in Buenos Aires. They were held in Brazil, but the summit was held in Italy. In 2021 in Japan, and this year it was held in Paris. And what you'll see is that we have a 4-year intervals between where it's held. And what is done is then a stock take is done of what has been pledged, who met their pledges, but also new pledges are made. So again, who attends Nutrition for Growth Summit? Besides the familiar faces you see there on that picture, is that number one, policymakers attend. Policymakers, in this case, I mean a lot of government representatives. Often who come there are ministers of finance. And the reason is because this is largely seen as a fundraising opportunity. So ministers of finance are often there and often will also be accompanied by, for example, if they have a parastatal that works around economics and economic development and so on. They sometimes could be accompanied by a minister of health, and also Minister of Agriculture. There are also private sector representatives, and these range from medium micro enterprises or medium enterprises to large scale private sector representatives that come there. Civil society organizations also attend the meeting. And then there are representatives from various international organizations. For example, the CGIAR was represented this year, and then the UN agencies are also represented, and then there are finance sector representatives. And I say finance sector to talk about, for example, their traditional donors, whether they're related to governments, but also regional banks, the regional development banks are there. And I specifically mentioned regional development banks because of a conversation that will come up later. And when these people attend the summit, often they have made various kind of pledges to be there, and I'll talk about the pledges later. So how is Nutrition for Growth Summit on that week? How is it organized? So the first thing is that there's the 2 days of the main 26th to 28th that we had the 2 days, but the 3 days leading to what is the main plenary or conference, this year there was something called a Village of Solutions. In this Village of Solutions, what happens is that there are booths, probably similar to what we'll have at the science fair, and different organizations then display what they consider solutions to address various nutrition issues. This year, there was FAOs represented through their country office in Senegal, and I mentioned them because they were, I think, the only booth that had a specific booth related to fisheries, and they were talking about how Senegal is moving forward in terms of commercializing their oyster production and doing aquaculture around that. And there were various other organizations presenting what they have around for commercial fortificants, around how they work with the health sector to address maternal and child nutrition and so on. In parallel, there's also what is called the Civil Society Pavilion. And the Civil Society Pavilion is various civil society organizations come together or form coalitions to talk about issues that matter to them. Remember, this is Nutrition for Growth, so it's not just about diets, but it's everything that influences nutrition. So there are others talking about, for example, immunization, access to sanitation and hygiene services, and so on. So this is another important way to draw attention to an issue that's important. So civil society organizations. So for example, if we were well funded, what WorldFish could have done is, for example, have maybe small fishes organization present what they do and why funding them is important in terms of economic development. I can think, for example, of the West African small fishes organization called REFEPA, who would have been actually a very important key in bringing attention to small-scale fishes and their importance to economies. Then on top of that, there's what are called side events. So they are what the Nutrition for Growth Summit calls the official side events. These are akin to parallel events in a scientific conference. This is a summit, it's not a scientific conference, but then you have side events where there are different organizations that come together again to advocate for what they find important. I just made a screenshot of WorldFish organized side event. We came together as WorldFish, various partners, EDF, FAO, Oceana, small family foundations, Walton Family More Foundation, and the Meridian Center, as well as Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and had a side event around global action and demystifying the nutrition power of aquatic foods. Summary of impressions. I think we were largely successful based on who attended. We had an opening from the Minister of Fisheries, and I could be saying this wrong, from Norway. the chief of the fisheries section of FAO, Manuel Barange, gave also an opening and advocating for why we should invest in nutrition. And a representative from the Ministry of Food Security and Fisheries from the German government was also present and gave some closing remarks. So I think in that sense, I mean, the kind of people who were able to attract. We had, I think, close to 100 people online, and in the room we were 20. And I mean, relative to other side events, I think the attention was, I mean, the attendance was good, and we had representatives from across diverse regions, but also diverse sector, from academia, from research, from civil society, and so on. I could send the link on the recording from YouTube for anyone who's interested to listen to what we were talking about. And this was also an opportunity to sort of, a fundraising opportunity for those that work in nutrition and so on. I just want to point out the key question that ended our session. It was specifically from the representative from the German government. And his question was, where are the numbers? And I think I came back with that question, where are the numbers? What he meant is, again, what I said in the beginning, it's clear $1 invested in nutrition, and often they mean nutrition-specific intervention, results in a $23 return. Can we articulate the same around investing in the fisheries sector? What's the return when you consider the benefits for nutrition, the benefits in terms of youth empowerment and women, youth involvement, women empowerment, climate sustainability? Is it possible to do that? Can we find a way we can communicate those kind of numbers? My impression from Nutrition for Growth Summit is that those kind of numbers spur action from donors, from governments, and so on. Again, in terms of how it's organized, the final thing is the 2 days, where this was what happens from the 26th to 28th. I have just taken a screenshot of the program of one of the days. The reason I do this is I just wanted you to see, how the thematic sessions are titled, but also who is there. Africa Development Bank featured very strongly at the Nutrition for Growth Summit. Asia Development Bank also did have a session, and I'll talk later about what the pledges were from this. World Bank was there very strongly, and certain countries also did give specific pledges. I mention this because this could influence our direction in terms of who do we pivot, or who do we more strongly approach in terms of funding, but also how do we articulate to these people why it's important that research around fisheries is supported to be able to respond to some of the issues they traditionally fund. I also want to mention one organization that you see there at the bottom, Nutrition International, which is an organization that is, in terms of nutrition, I'd say they are moving not only around programs, but together with GAIN, Global Alliance for Nutrition, also are more and more having strong nutrition research, and could be organizations that we think around partnering with. They have a strong voice globally, but have not traditionally spoken around the fisheries sector. Often they have dwelled on fortification and so on, and thinking around how we partner with this kind of organization to also piggyback on the voice they have, not only in the countries where they operate, but also among donors. But preparation for this summit, I've given you what happens on the week, starts way before the summit happens. I think one of the things that happens before the summit begins is a setup of a coordination mechanism within countries. So countries often assign a lead ministry and then create a multi-sectoral working group, and there are various actors involved. And the idea is that through all those 8 processes that I show you, is that countries come up with pledges. So often countries come up with pledges around, when policy makers come up with pledges, they come up with pledges around creating an enabling environment, supporting policies that enable moving forward in terms of meeting the nutrition targets, or supporting food systems transformation that, for example, production patterns do not just favor producing calorie-dense foods, but they also favor production of nutrient-dense foods, for example, so like the fishery sector and so on. And this is the process, and this happens. So we've just finished the summit. This is going on. I bring this up to say that the entry point for WorldFish in terms of us having as voice at Nutrition for Growth Summit and ensuring we spotlight the fisheries sector and that more funding is directed not only to fisheries, but the research that supports whatever we advance in the aquatic food systems, this is the key entry point for us. And again, I think this means us working strongly with country offices to set up us being part of this coordination mechanism, being part of technical working groups in which we keep saying, don't forget the fisheries sector, or when they talk about animal source foods and it's livestock and poultry and it's milk or dairy and eggs and so on, we are saying this fisheries sector must be part of this conversation, but also working together with the government personnel that are part of the fisheries ministries to be able to articulate some of these messages and be able to also themselves push this agenda. And I think that's another entry point that I think we need to strengthen how we work. I think as part of saying this, it is, when I was thinking about this, I thought about, the developments around Cambodia and how WorldFish has been important in terms of the food systems nutrition, I think, action plan, and maybe I'm naming it wrong. Mike and Quenya are there. And the role that WorldFish has played, then what opportunity it plays for us to now grow together to be able to, ensure that the fisheries sector continues to be part of the conversation. And therefore, we are able to receive the funding that, supports moving forward. So the questions that I asked from looking at this entry point is, and I keep asking, even as we think about how we work within the countries and so on, is that, is fisheries involved in the agenda setting as key in meeting nutrition targets? I suspect the answer will be largely no. And what is said about the fisheries sector in the national nutrition action plans? Various countries have national nutrition action plans that are either in development or being developed. And it's from these national nutrition action plans that budgetary lines towards specific sectors are then set. And if fisheries does not feature there, and the fisheries then receives no attention in the national nutrition action plans. I think beyond the national nutrition action plans, and I haven't put it there, is also seeing how we leverage on other sectors that are adjacent to meeting nutrition needs. So is fisheries mentioned, for example, where there are, for example, targets around climate action? And how can nutrition also be part of those discussions around gender empowerment, around youth employment, and so on, and not isolating discussions around nutrition to just one sector, understanding that nutrition needs to be mainstreamed in all these discussions because they are interconnected. And again, just asking again, another entry point is, how do we engage as country offices as part of certain processes that are important to draw attention? And I know we are overworked and stretched and so on, but probably we could identify certain key processes that we could be part of. And if we are part of them, maybe draw us a greater spotlight that we are part of these processes and so on, that they can receive a highlight, for example, in some of these international meetings and so on. So I just want to talk about now the pledges. I'm sure everyone is curious what the pledges were. Again, I said there were pledges around policy and so on and what civil society. I think for us who do research, and our research is dependent on grants and so on and financing in whatever form, what we're curious about is how the pledges, financial pledges look like. I give an example, or an illustration of how the pledges looked like from 2013 to 2025. You do see a dip in 2017. The reason there was this dip is that the 2017 summit in Italy was mainly treated as a step event, and this was just because there were major humanitarian crises at that time, issues in Yemen, in Syria, the Rohingya crisis, and so on. And this diverted resources and political attention, understandably so. It is also around the time there was new political leadership, probably also what we're experiencing now in major donor countries, and this led to budgetary uncertainty. So a lot of donors and countries were a bit cautious around pledging. What the good news is, in 2025, despite what we all know the funding environment is based on issues around the US reorganizing itself, let's call it that, the pledges moved from 27 billion USD in 2021 to 28 billion in 2025. And generally for nutrition, that's a win. I think for me, the question was to know to which sectors these pledges have been made towards. The other thing is that there were pledges by specific institution. Again, this is monetary pledges that are being made. And I'm sure you'll ask me, how are these pledges made? Who tracks? I will talk about that. But first of all, let's just look at who pledged and what they pledged. And I just pick key organization that pledged amounts of notable amounts. Let's put that quote unquote. I don't know if on my side, it's on the left. We have BMGF, which is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all the way to World Vision. We do see three very prominent bars. The first one is from the EU, and this is specifically for the European Commission. And then we see World Bank and the Africa Development Bank. The sectors that were mentioned, there was no specific mention of this funding is pledged towards the fisheries sector. That was not a specific mention. A lot of this was pledged towards what was called maternal and child nutrition. And I mentioned that so that as we think about how we fundraise, these are the, let me say, keywords or key sectors we should articulate as working towards. There was a lot of mention of fortification. And this is important because we do have research showing that I think it was 1 gram of fish powder, I could be getting the grammage wrong, provides sufficient nutrients as the current sachet of food fortificant that is promoted. And when we think about the changing ODA environment, especially for low and middle income countries, then can we say, if you're pledging towards fortification, then you can pledge towards product development for fisheries, because we can meet the required nutrient intake with the current fisheries sector. So food fortification was mentioned, multiple micronutrient supplementation was mentioned specifically, and also the school feeding program was a big one. I mentioned school feeding program because I think, and I'm giving my thoughts as we go along, I think that we need to clearly articulate as WorldFish what is our offering around school feeding program. What does school, including aquatic foods into school meal programs, offer in terms of nutrients to the school children? What are the outcomes? So does it improve cognitive development? Does it, does it improve micronutrient status and so on? But a big question, and two big questions that still remain and have been barriers for us to break through into school feeding programs, is how do we address the safety related to including aquatic foods into school feeding programs, but also the question around costs. The question is, why should we have aquatic foods in school feeding programs in areas where, for example, iron biofortified beans are there and they're much cheaper, they don't have the same issues of spoilage? And again, the articulation of the benefits, not just in terms of the benefits to articulating the benefits, so that we are not only talking about that it's higher cost, but you're saying, yes, for this amount, more amount that you give, this is how much return you get, and having this kind of ways that we generate why it's important to have aquatic foods present into school feeding programs. So I still think that's a big area that was quite a bit of funding. In fact, a lot of the funding from Rockefeller, from Children Investment Funds, CIF, is towards that. The Africa Development, the Asia Development Bank did not make a new pledge. They maintained the pledge that they made towards 2025, that they are committed to keep meeting that pledge of, it was 14 billion or so, that they want to continue meeting. So there was no specific pledge made around that. And basically, the general Asia Development Bank narrative around their pledges has been to improve nutrition and avert crises where there are nutrition crises. So I ask that, is there money for the fish in the pledges? And here I just give again a table of who pledged and towards what, and it just shows what sectors were mentioned or what direction were mentioned. Where I have Team Europe, it's just the European Commission, Global Affairs Canada was present, despite the fact that they were not, they were present but not very visible because of the going into elections and so on. So they didn't want to make very loud pronouncements, but they did give a pledge. But you see, they just say it's for nutrition programming. We do see some countries that give specific amounts and where they want to direct it towards. And what I just wanted to show you is that if you're looking for them to specifically say this is towards the fisheries sector, that's not specifically how it's worded, but we do have entry points in which the fisheries sector does respond, especially where they talk of child nutrition, children and women nutrition, and it's seeing how then we approach these organizations and how we partner with them. So the fisheries sector is not specifically mentioned in the pledges. And so the question is, which way do we move forward based on these pledges? And I'm coming towards the end. I think I'm seeing a lot of questions and like to have that discussion based on this that we found. So I think the first question is, I titled it Pivot. Probably we already work with regional banks, but maybe not to the extent that it could be. And could it be that we pivot more to regional banks, working with Africa Development Bank, Asia Development Bank, so that we articulate that whatever is required to be done needs to be supported by research, and research financing is important. What I want to point to here is, as we think around working with regional banks, all other organizations that are donor funded are also thinking the same. And how are we then saying, what is our special offering that would want to make us, the regional banks want to work with us in terms of research financing, because they do have financing for research. If I point specifically to the Africa Development Bank, I was just listening, was it yesterday too? They are having their Africa Development Bank president elections next month, and what their priorities are. There's a lot of mention of around filling the productivity gap, and the productivity gap for the candidates. When they mention it, they then pivot to saying to fill the productivity gap, what is really needed is improving infrastructure. So around roads, electricity, I guess, ports are included. But can we have a conversation around productivity gap around fisheries and the gap that I showed around how production of aquatic foods needs to increase to meet the growing demands. There is also a lot of talk around. I'm just looking at my notes there here on Africa Development Bank priorities around how the bank needs to specifically or narrow down the sectors which they finance. And my question is, how do we make sure that they see fisheries as an underinvested sector that could have large gains for the region? There is a lot of talk also around the bank financing reduction of trade barriers and taking advantage of the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. And what's our research around influencing that trade policies, whether by the AU or specific countries, are nutrition sensitive as they take advantage of the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. So as we pivot to regional banks, I'm just thinking around how do we show that we are responding to the nutrition needs, but also the current needs of the regions that we work with. There's also, I should mention a big one that I think is also across Africa and Asia, is that there is a burgeoning youth population, and what can the aquatic food sector offer to address this? I bring this even if they're not directly related to nutrition, because I still believe in terms of thinking about economic empowerment and livelihoods development this is also a strategy of addressing some of the nutrition gaps that we have, knowing that poverty is the underlying factor around many of the nutrition deficits we see. I think the other thing that we need to do is articulate how our technologies approaches are part of the areas mentioned consistently. How are our technologies part of food fortification, around how are our technologies around addressing important around addressing women and children malnutrition, addressing issues of crisis and fragility, because there was quite a bit of funding that is being pledged towards addressing crisis and fragility. And can we show this? And I've talked about school feeding programs and articulating this to be able to further our work. I think the third thing that is not new to any of us is tapping into national governments that made pledges and specifically mentioned fisheries. And this is low-hanging fruits. I see a spelling mistake there, but I think Bangladesh was one of the countries that strongly mentioned them seeing fisheries as important in addressing nutrition issues. Indonesia is a country we're not currently worked in, but they made a pledge around policy innovations and supporting an environment that allows the fisheries sector to grow as addressing nutrition. Senegal was another. I have Indonesia there, but there's also Burkina Faso and so on. Are these countries or national governments who could think around partnering, similar to what we are doing along with Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, to be able to work with them around what they want to achieve in their fisheries sector and be part to work with them so that the growth is directed towards addressing nutrition. A big part of the Nutrition Summit was also the private sector. This has also come up a lot when I listened to, the Africa Development Development Bank presidential candidates around how do we tap more into the private sector for financing for some of the things that we want to do, and this I think also for us in research, and also for demonstrating impact. So, for example, when I think about the private sector, I'm looking specifically around the fish-based products that we've developed as WorldFish over the years, and I keep coming back to them, is how can we entice the private sector to invest in this and work with us to support research that informs their growth, right? And a graduation from not just small and micro enterprises, but even bigger industrial development around enabling the further growth of this sector of fish-based products. And I think also articulating to the private sector, because a lot of private sector that was there is they also want to invest things that have multiple wins. So it's not only demonstrating that it's profitable for them, but that also it has social impacts. And how do we articulate that? So I live with a lot of questions, but these are the impressions that I got from the Nutrition for Growth Summit and how we move forward. And these are very initial raw impressions that require to be to have some meat in terms of how we formulate and how we move forward. So should WorldFish be represented? I know Anissa should be finishing. So I started off with what is Nutrition for Growth Summit and why should WorldFish be represented at the Nutrition for Growth Summit. And I just say this because I know it's largely unknown for us in WorldFish. We more participate, for example, in the COP, but also to advocate that in the next 4 years that will be more strongly featured there and have a greater voice. And the reason is because the biggest one, I'll just say two things I'll say. That I think our presence will strongly elevate the role of aquatic foods in nutrition, and that the fisheries sector is not, because the fisheries sector is not necessarily mentioned, and this will influence global nutrition policy and investments. I think another reason that we strongly need to be there and more strongly present in the next one is that it amplifies the voice of the global south, and that is where we work. So I'll not go into this. I'm just summarizing that our presence ensures that aquatic foods are not left behind, that there's not only talk around poultry and biofortified foods, but that fisheries is featured strongly in discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Wanjiku. We have about 5 minutes left, and there's so much conversation happening in the chat. So I was thinking of an efficient way to do this. So I was wondering, we can spend the last 5 minutes actually inviting the people who have contributed in the chat to have sort of an open conversation between you and them. And I hope people in the chat are open to do this, because I think the audience is more or less WorldFish family, so we can have this conversation in an intimate setting. So I do hope you don't mind me saying some names, and you can turn on your camera and microphone and we can have this discussion together. So Michelle, if you can, Mariska, Eddie, Marlene, and Mike Ackerster, and also Quinny. I see you have contributed a lot in the chat, and I would love to hear where your thoughts are, and we can have sort of an exchange. All right, Michelle, turn on first, and then followed by Eddie, and then Marlene, and Mike Eckister. So perhaps one universal question that Michelle can start, and then we can sort of bounce around between all of you. Michelle, would you like to start?
Wow, universal question. Okay, I would say one, thanks Wanjiku for a great presentation. That was really interesting. And I think the reason why a lot of us were commenting or having side conversation in the chat was because it resonates with a lot of the things that we've been thinking about in our respective areas of work. And so I think the two things I wanted to highlight was one, I think the point you made about can we, as a low-hanging fruit, focus on countries that have aquatic foods in their pledges. Well, I think similarly, countries would have aquatic foods in their climate strategies or biodiversity strategies. Mariska mentioned aquaculture plans. And so I'm wondering if we as WorldFish can inform our engagement better if we sort of analyze what countries' priorities are across these different dimensions on aquatic foods to inform our engagement. And I think the second question we had was more broadly on this, working more closely with government partners on engaging these international processes and national strategy developments. Can we do that in a more holistic way so that it's not you, I don't know, trying to work with Ahmed on nutrition in Egypt and me trying to work with Ahmed on UNFCCC in Egypt, and then like Mariska trying to work with Ahmed on aquaculture plan in Egypt. Sorry that Ahmed is now the example. But yeah, can we do this a bit more strategically and holistically as an organization? So those were my questions.
I was hoping that I think a lot of the way we move forward is dependent on how, like you said, how we organize better with the country offices. And it would be good to hear from them. I think the challenge that for me I see with, for example, for nutrition is, you know how we were talking, Michelle, like we need to articulate better what our offering is. And if we can have a standard message around nutrition, climate change, and the 3 impact areas, and then have the countries then just contextualize it to what the needs in the specific countries are, I think that would be a better way that we approach how we engage. And I like that you say how we engage with country partners. I think a lot of our country offices are doing that. There's developments that Mike talked about and so on. And Zambia is doing that and Egypt is doing that. In an environment where also human resources are challenged, I think it's prioritizing which specific processes have the most impact for us to engage in. And how you do that, I don't know, to be honest, but I think it's that number one. I would also like to make a comment around, there's a lot said about how we engage with government. I think we need to do better also about how we engage with private sector. I think it's largely untapped. And I know when we think about private sector and the growth for the global south, it's mostly small and micro enterprises. A lot of trade is informal and all those challenges come. But I think there's an opportunity there that we need to tap better. I know I've not answered everything you asked, but yeah.
Perhaps Mike could comment a bit about the country perspective. Mike.
Thanks. Well, I'll refer to Cambodia and Myanmar, where inland capture fisheries are hugely important and sadly in decline. And there's not an awful lot we can do about it. But one important point, I think, is that we have not really evaluated the importance of the inland capture fisheries. In the chat, I made reference to the fact that 50% of the population in Myanmar are now classified as living in poverty. That's around 30 million people, and yet they're still productive. They're still alive. They still work the farms. They still produce food. The agricultural sector, including fisheries, the fisheries sector within the agriculture sector receives 0.5% of the national budget for agriculture. Irrigation receives 70%. So if you look at the investment in fisheries, it is minuscule, and yet it delivers a safety net for people to survive, to get essential nutrition, and to eke out their diet, which is largely rice-based. So I think what would be very useful is to be able to have an analysis of the importance of these inland capture fisheries. We are planning to do so with funding, which we're putting concept notes for So let's see how we move forwards this year and next with these analyses. Over.
Eddie, any comments from yourself?
Yeah, a great presentation, very thought-provoking. I think a lot of us are sort of thinking, well, how can we do this? And I think my comments that I've been adding to the chat are, well, there's some bits of this that we've had a go at, that we can respond to, that we can pull out and reframe, to give Wanjiku the kind of evidence she needs when going to these meetings. But there are key gaps, and I think some of those are quite hard to fill. We've tried in the past. There was an analysis led by Chris Benet that did a systematic evaluation of, is there any evidence that development investment in fisheries and aquaculture has led to improvements in nutrition? And we couldn't find any direct evidence of the type that meets, that scrutiny. So, I think that we would have to be careful in coming up with a figure to ensure that we got it peer reviewed, to make sure that it is credible, because I think otherwise we could be dismissed as a lobby group, as it were. So I think this is something we could put together a group to explore. What would it take to get the evidence that Wanjiku feels would be necessary to be convincing in the forums that she's entering, and how do we do that? I think that's a good starting point for a little discussion group. So thank you, Wanjiku.
You're welcome. And I know Anis wants to close, but I think that's a key one for me. And like you said, I don't know if you can even just do that broadly for investment in crops or whatever. I think generally it's difficult, but we can find maybe a more immediate benefit that is on the pathway to impact for nutrition. And like you said, discussion in a smaller group. Thank you.
With that, we're 3 minutes after the time. Thank you so much for all of you who impromptu and very spontaneously joined the conversation and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much. Thank you to Wanjiku for such a wonderful presentation. We have such a rich conversation happening in the chat that we will download and I will share with Wanjiku to ponder over more. And we can see what can be done beyond this Fish for Thought. So thank you very much again to all of you also for joining in and lending in your hour plus, and hoping to see all of you again in the next one. Thank you so much.